Hey everyone, welcome back. This is another multifamily brief. I'm Brian Briscoe, host of the Diary of an Apartment Investor podcast. And today I want to share a story and talk about some hard-earned insights about one of the most important decisions that newer investors are going to have to make, and that's market selection. It's something that every one of my coaching clients spends a lot of time focusing on. Which market do I invest in? And quite frankly, everybody who's new to this game is going to go through this particular decision-making process. So story time now. 5 years ago, I went to a conference. There was a guy there that I really respected. I hadn't known him for very long, but he was head and shoulders above me as far as where he was at the time, and he's still head and shoulders above me as far as what he's done with multifamily. He invited me to do a dinner with a few of his investor friends. Basically he had formed a mastermind with other people that were roughly the same age and same level as him. Now, at this time, I think I was right around the 600 or 700 unit mark. I did just say 6-7. And within my coaching program, I was doing extremely well. I was sort of the poster child. I was invited to speak at this conference. And as I was sitting at this table, I realized really quickly that I was a small fish in a very big pond. And so what I did is I decided to listen and not talk. And I spent most of the dinner just paying attention. And I realized something. Everybody at that table had something that I didn't. A very tight geographic focus. Meanwhile, I had deals in several different states and had just started a fund to raise for deals in, any random state that I find. Now, part of the conversation that has really stuck with me was from a guy who said he hadn't bought a marketed deal in a decade. And I remember looking at him thinking, wow, that's all we've bought. Everything we've bought has come with a nice, shiny offering memorandum from a broker who probably blasted it out to his distro list of several thousand people. But when I really started thinking about that, it made sense. He had a very strict geographical area that he would operate in. One single city. Now, it was a fairly large city, which is important, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. He had a very good reputation for closing, and he also had a very strict deal criteria. He was only doing B-class multifamily value adds, with a certain unit count, right? And so what was happening is whenever a broker had a deal that they knew would sell that met his requirements, they would pick up the phone and they would talk to him first. Now, you don't get that kind of treatment from brokers if your criteria is, I'll buy anything in Texas or Florida, all right? It just doesn't happen, all right? Now, in the first company that I formed, we owned properties across South Carolina and parts of Georgia. All right, sounds pretty manageable, right? South Carolina geographically is a relatively small state, and the two properties in Georgia were in Augusta, which you cross the river and you're in South Carolina. All right, but we had 3 or sometimes 4 different property managers on this portfolio, and there wasn't a single property manager who would cover our entire portfolio. In some cases, it was because, okay, this one's too small for us to do, or this one's too big for us to do, or we don't operate in that city, but we do operate in this city. And to compound things, we couldn't, once again, we're talking just the state of South Carolina with, Augusta, Georgia added, driving from one property to the next. And by the way, I strongly recommend you visit every single property at least once a month, okay? But driving from one property to the next took days, not hours. Okay. It was a logistical and operational headache. And so, at this dinner that I went to, I started formulating, next steps for me. I think I had already left that first company, or I decided to leave that first company. Maybe hadn't 100% done it yet, but I decided to focus on Utah and make it a Utah-based investing firm. Why Utah, you may ask? Well, quite frankly, I had a competitive advantage there. Okay, there was something that I had that other people investing from the outside in did not have. All right, I was born and raised there. I've lived there most of my life. I know the areas, I know the neighborhoods, I know what's important, and I know the culture and the people. Okay, which, like I said, it gives me a competitive advantage, but also it's a competitive advantage that I can continue to grow. All right, get to know local contractors, CPAs, investors, brokers, all of that. Deepen relationships in one single metro instead of trying to do that everywhere, okay? What I decided to do is just essentially scale smarter, and not chase every hot market across the country. And when you look at deal selection, I think there's two philosophies, and they're diametrically opposed. Philosophy number one, Neil Bawa is a subscriber to this philosophy, and he told me, he came on my podcast a while ago and said that it's extremely difficult, but he's built his business around this philosophy. Philosophy number one is chase every hot market. Look at the data across the country, and if the data says you invest in Scottsdale, Arizona, you go to Scottsdale, Arizona. Okay. Now, I think the opposite is double down in one metro and go deep. Okay. Now, the second option is going to give you operational efficiencies, okay, that you're not going to be able to have if you're opening up shop in a new metro every single year. You're also going to build your reputation with brokers, and not just brokers, but everybody involved in the trade, property managers and everything. All right. And now you can build your systems, you can build your teams, and you're not starting from scratch every time you pick a new metro, every time you buy a new property. Okay. And one other thing is it's a lot easier to raise capital, especially if you're leveraging that one single market to raise capital. You can find local investors. And this is a truth that I think exists almost everywhere. I guess debatable if it's a truth, if it exists almost everywhere. But we're just going to ignore that philosophical discussion right there. But this is something that I think is largely true. People like to invest in their own market. And part of convincing people to invest with you is convincing them that the market that you're investing in is a good, solid market. Okay. Now, if you're raising money in the same market every single time, you don't have to keep on reconvincing your investors and familiarizing them with a new market every time. Now, there's also the question, what things should I look for in a market? Number one, you have to have that competitive advantage. Do you have a competitive advantage in that market? And I think first and foremost, that is the most important thing here. Okay. And if you don't necessarily have a competitive advantage, can you establish and build one? Okay. That's second, but still good. All right. Population size, it has to be a large enough city where you can actually build something, all right, where there's enough apartment complexes where you can build a company. Now, case in point, I live in Idaho Falls. It's a very small city, but it's not big enough to support our goals, so maybe later I'll buy a couple of properties here, but my primary focus is still Salt Lake City because it checks all the boxes. The last thing, which is also important, is growth trends. You want to invest in a growing market, okay? Now, are all of these absolutely vital? Can you do well in a market that's not, top of the line in growth? Yeah, you can, is the answer. You can really, if you understand the markets, which that competitive advantage comes in. If you understand your markets, you can build almost anywhere. But man, having population and economic growth really, really do help. Okay. Now, end of the day, if you're an operator or planning to become one, consider stacking your properties close together. Okay, that's going to allow you to grow your relationships. It's going to allow you to grow your systems and your influence all in one particular spot. So don't necessarily chase trends and try to invest in that hottest city, on whoever's top 10 list. Try to build something sustainable. Now, if you're looking for a place to grow alongside other serious investors, check out the Tribe of Titans. It's thetribeoftitans.com, and we'll see you next time.